Our theme for this month of November is attention. And when I selected the title, Pay Attention, for today's service, what I didn't anticipate is that when Steve Cohen would put it on our sign on 202, and it just says, Pay Attention, it's like it kind of doubles as a public service announcement for drivers. So toward that end, I will be receiving sermon title ideas that double as public service announcements. Our story today was a story about a bear named Henry who lives in a cabin out in the woods writing a book. Now, I know there are a lot of longtime Unitarian Universalists in this congregation, so don't disappoint me. Who is this bear named Henry? Henry David Thoreau. Yes, Henry David Thoreau, who famously went out into the woods because he wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, to learn what life has to teach, and not, when he came to die, discovered that he had not, in fact, actually lived. Henry David Thoreau, both the man and the bear, were dedicated to their work. But the work was not so much the writing part, but the paying attention part. For 2 years and 2 months, Thoreau lived in a small one-room cabin out at Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts, paying attention to nature and to people to learn what life has to teach, to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, and then secondarily, to write about it. I remember when I first encountered passages from Walden, I was in high school learning about the Transcendentalists. And in my mind, when I thought of Thoreau going out to Walden, I imagined that he had retreated to the middle of nowhere, living in isolation for 2 years. But the truth, as our story illustrated today, is that he was within walking distance to the center of Concord, Massachusetts. It's the same distance from Concord to Walden Pond as this church is to Brandywine Creek State Park. So imagine it. You have built a cabin in Brandywine Creek State Park, and you're living there for 2 years and 2 days, paying attention to nature and writing about your thoughts. And let's face it, people are out there all the time. Hikers, birders, people who have packed a lunch, disc golfers. There's going to be high school cross-country meets. If you lived out there, I bet you could even order a pizza from your phone. You call an Uber to take you to the mall. And so when Thoreau was out at Walden, people were there all the time, sometimes to see him, sometimes just out for a stroll in the woods, others just passing through. He encountered families, businessmen on their day off, people wanting to chit-chat with him. In his book, Walden, Thoreau writes honestly about his judgments of various visitors. He writes about, quote, the restless, committed men whose time was all taken up in getting a living or keeping it, ministers who spoke of God as if they enjoyed a monopoly on the subject, the snooping housewife who somehow came to know that his sheets were not as clean as hers. He says the old and the infirm and the timid of whatever age or sex thought most of sickness and sudden accident and death. To them, life seemed full of danger. He spoke of men who overstayed their welcome and who talked on and on. He wrote, men who did not know when their visit had terminated. Though I went about my business again, answering them from greater and greater remoteness. But it isn't all bad. He wrote of more welcome visitors to his cabin, children come a-berrying, railroad men taking a Sunday morning walk in clean white shirts, fishermen and hunters, poets and philosophers, in short, all honest pilgrims who came out to the woods for freedom's sake and really left the village behind. Thoreau says that in his cabin he kept 1 chair for solitude, 2 chairs for company, and 3 for society. More than that could visit, but they would need to stand. It makes me wonder what version of me might show up to Thoreau's cabin and what he would say about our visit. He might write in his journal, "A woman named Pam was here scrolling on her phone through Facebook while we visited, complaining about how the Democrats were handling this impeachment process. I tried to show her how the light reflects so beautifully on the pond, but she just kept showing me these sarcastic Facebook memes." Henry David Thoreau did not go out into the woods simply to get away from people. If he did, he didn't get very far. In addition to encountering businessmen and families taking a walk, Thoreau had visitors who were in deep need, people who were debilitatingly lonely, people who were poor and needing food, enslaved people who were constantly listening for dogs, and people who were trying to find their tracks as they continued to make their way north toward freedom. 2 years ago at the Unitarian Universalist Association General Assembly, the annual Ware Lecture was given by Brian Stevenson, who is an attorney and Delawarean, and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. He talked about his work with people who are poor, who are wrongly condemned, who are trapped in our criminal justice system. And he said that one of the things that changed his life was getting to know people on death row. He said that our lives can be changed simply by getting to know people we wouldn't otherwise know, and urge us to get proximate to people so that we can pay attention to their story. There is a way in which Thoreau, living out his cabin in the woods, actually got more proximate with people who needed his attention. As I read Walden, I'm aware that spending 2 years and 2 days out in the woods did not make Thoreau perfect. It did not bring him constant happiness or make him shake off his grumpiness. It didn't even bring him great professional success. Although it's a widely popular book now, it was not so in his lifetime. Upon leaving Walden, Thoreau stayed with the Emersons for a bit before moving back into his parents' home and working in his family's pencil factory. But he continued to walk in the woods every day and continued to write in his journal. He became a conductor for the Underground Railroad, and so he was extraordinarily successful, and his work was undeniably important. I think that is true as well for Thoreau's friends who were part of this 19th century Unitarian and Transcendentalist group practicing this art of paying attention. In our story today, Henry the Bear encounters some of these friends. William Ellery Channing urges Henry to go fishing with him in our story. Channing is considered the father of American Unitarianism and an instigator of Transcendentalist thought. Frederick Hosmer was a hymn writer whose hymn, Forward Through the Ages, was an anthem of the social gospel movement, an early social justice movement of religious people. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Unitarian minister, transcendentalist, influential writer. Amos Bronson and Abby May Alcott, parents of Louisa May Alcott, and he was an educator and also a 19th century vegan before vegan was a word. Nathaniel Hawthorne and his wife Sophia Peabody, both writers, he famously writing The Scarlet Letter. This group of people were fierce abolitionists, feminists, and advocates for children in their lifetimes. The bears of this story are all real characters. Like many of us in this time and place, we're looking around at society and noticing places of corruption and greed. They became wary of institutions and systems which become self-serving over time and that privilege some people over other people. They observed religious systems that had a kind of fundamentalist focus on otherworldly things, like a vengeful God who punishes people, or preoccupation with the rules of salvation. Or on the other side of the pendulum, they critiqued people who were too intellectual, staying in their heads, avoiding their hearts, unable to see the mysteries and beauty that is all around us. Instead, transcendentalists sought a kind of balance, inviting one another to reflect on their own inner wisdom and the wisdom inherent in nature. In the fall of 1837, some years before Thoreau had any thoughts of retreating to Walden Pond, Ralph Waldo Emerson forever changed the life of his friend Henry David Thoreau with a simple question: do you keep a journal? Thoreau had recently graduated in the top of his class at Harvard. The country was in an economic depression, and Thoreau went to work at his family's pencil factory. And on Emerson's urging, Thoreau started journaling. 8 years later, he got permission to use a piece of Emerson's land off of Walden Pond, built there a small cabin, and lived for the next 2 years paying attention and writing about it. Mary Oliver wrote that attention is the beginning of devotion. If attention is the beginning of devotion, then we might want to be deliberate about where we turn our attention. Because where we turn our attention becomes that to which we devote our lives. And we do not want to end up at the end of our days only to learn that we have devoted our lives in the wrong direction. To learn at the end of life that we have not lived, because as Thoreau reminds us, living is so dear. And don't we know it? In the last several weeks, this congregation has lost beloveds to death. We lost Joe Sandberg, Hetty Franca, whose celebration of life is this afternoon in Arden. Alma Steinmetz, who we remembered yesterday, and his beautiful flowers are here from that service yesterday. Anna Sue Presley Pulse, who was a member of this congregation. And the thing about death is that it reminds us of just how fleeting life is. How it can seem to end in just an instant, just when we're starting to get the hang of it. With so much death in the air, I've been reflecting a lot on my years as a hospice chaplain. The first year that I was a hospice chaplain, I was still a student in seminary. It was 16 years ago. And I met a lot of patients, a lot of hospice patients who were veterans. And I have to admit that I felt woefully inadequate for these conversations. As a Gen Xer, I am removed from these experiences of war. They would name battles and medals that they had, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And many of these veterans told me that they had never before in their life talked about the war in any meaningful way. But there we were. They were in their final weeks or final days of life, and finally choosing to talk about the trauma and violence of war. Choosing to speak out loud about the pain of losing so many friends at once. Finally talking about the guilt of surviving all of that. The guilt of killing. And so often they would tell me a story about war, about their experience, and then end on the same heartbreaking question. Chaplain, will God forgive me? And something I had to learn was not to answer those kinds of theological questions. And sometimes I still forget, because I want to. My impulse is to say, yes, God will forgive you. But what I've learned is that when someone asks me, will God forgive me? What they're really saying is, I feel really bad about something. And when I pay attention to what that person really needs to talk about, I notice it's not about whether there is some God who dispenses forgiveness, but about why they feel bad, and about the regret and the pain and the grief, and ultimately healing and recovery, which they might find includes God's forgiveness. My job as a chaplain and minister is to help you turn your attention toward your inner wisdom. And so when you ask me a theological question, the best response I might have is, tell me what you believe. Tell me why you're asking me this question. Tell me what you know to be true. When you ask me whether you will see your loved one in some kind of afterlife, which is a theological question, and I want to say yes. But what I hope to ask you in return is, tell me, what is your life like now that they're gone? And I hope to listen to the loneliness or the regret, maybe anger, maybe sadness, to listen for your longing for this person who has gone, so that you can access your inner wisdom, which you might find includes a belief in the afterlife. Attention is the beginning of devotion. And our Unitarian transcendentalist ancestors suggest that we not devote so much attention to other worldly ideas like, will God make me feel better about this? And not to devote so much attention to intellectual ideas like trying to prove that there is no God. The biggest questions of life, like, does God forgive me, or will I see my beloved after death? There's no adequate theological answers. And there's no adequate intellectual answers to these questions. But instead, we respond by simply paying attention. And we invite the questioner to pay attention to where they are now in their lives, to what they need, to how God is working in and around and through them. We might take them out into the woods. We might sit by a pond or a garden. We might travel through time and conjure up memories, happy and sad, mundane and profound. And while doing so, we might notice the bird that settles on a branch nearby as one speaks of grief and longing. We might notice how, as one becomes preoccupied with illness or infirmity, that a wind kicks up and carries the fresh smell of pine. Or how regret and worry can be interrupted by rising early and seeing the sunrise through the trees, or listening to the sounds of nature, waking up for yet another precious day of living. Going out into the woods, Thoreau paid attention to people he knew, fellow transcendentalists and others from Concord. And he paid attention to people he didn't know, people who were hungry and needing a bite to eat, enslaved people seeking freedom. And he might have shared some food or directed them north to safety, but at his best, I like to believe that he also paid attention. Is there any more important work in our lives than paying attention to that which is calling us back to life and using that attention to call others back with us? Thoreau wrote, "I took a walk in the woods and came out taller than the trees." And then he went on to make pencils to help enslaved people find freedom, to continue to walk in the woods every day, and to write about all of it. May we be so bold. I invite you to rise and sing with me. Hymn number 298, Wake Now My Senses. Please rise as you are able.